Now on BBC Two, Newsnight with Jeremy Paxman.
Tonight, when we said we'd democratise the House of Lords, what we really meant was that we'd replace this set of unelected individuals with another one. Why has the government forsaken this Labour touchstone? Caught, then released to try again. We report from Calais on the crowds of would-be immigrants trying to smuggle themselves to Britain. Does the government have a clue about how many of them make it? Question for the third time. The BBC's Andrew Gilligan is asked about why his two sets of notes on the crucial meeting with Dr. David Kelly don't tell the same story. And eyewitnesses claim 8 American soldiers died in this ambush. Have the Americans got any new ideas about how to deal with the increasingly sophisticated Iraqi insurgency? Good evening. The government kindly explained what it meant when it said that it wanted a more democratic and representative House of Lords. It wants to remove the last elements of accident of birth and have the second chamber there not by anything as quaint as elections, but appointed by a bunch of quangocrats. This apparently is bold, decisive government for the 21st century. In passing, incidentally, Geoffrey Archer will be stripped of his peerage. We'll talk to the architect of this reform, Charles Leslie Baron Faulkner of Thoroton, and to his Tory counterpart, Thomas Galloway Dunlop de Roy de Bleaky Galbraith, 2nd Baron Strathclyde, shortly. First, though, Martha Carney reports.
For at least a century, reform of the House of Lords has been pored over by constitutional experts. A long-running saga with as many twists and turns as a novel by the Lords' most notorious member. He's soon to be reformed out of the place, but otherwise, the government couldn't have been less radical. Plans to remove Geoffrey Archer's peerage and others with a criminal conviction have been welcomed by Labour politicians. They also support the abolition of the last hereditary peerages, but there was widespread dismay that the government had opted for a wholly appointed.
Many of those entitled to vote distinctly underwhelmed, to judge from the turnout. This was a Labour seat which looked virtually impregnable, but it turns out in the event to be rather more interesting than that. Our reporter Michael Crick is down at the counting of such votes as have been cast in Brent Town Hall. How's it looking, Michael?
Well, it's looking that nobody here really is predicting with any confidence who's going to win. It's clear it's a battle between Labour and the Lib Dems. The Conservatives are out of this race, even though they were second at the general election. But I've been round the polling stations, 13 polling stations I went round, 3 o'clock this afternoon onwards, and the numbers of people saying they were voting Labour was pretty much the same as the number of people saying they were voting Lib Dem. It's clear the Conservative vote is down. And there is a huge amount of disillusion, it's clear, with the government. I mean, if you think that at the general election, the Labour vote was 6 times what the Liberal Democrats were getting, to think that the Liberal Democrats are even within striking distance of that is a huge advance on their part, whether they win or not. And the really big issue, fascinatingly enough, is the war. I mean, that is what people mostly say as their reason as why they're switching from Labour to Liberal Democrat. Other questions of trust in the government, and particularly in Tony Blair. There's a lot of hostility towards Tony Blair himself. They bring up his name again and again and again, and of course a lot of ill feeling over public services as well.
Michael, we'll get back to you when you've got hopefully a bit of news for us in terms certainly of turnout and the rest of it, half an hour or so. Thanks. Well, now, while you've been watching this programme across the narrow strip of sea that separates us from the... Got any exciting news from the Brent by-election? Anything particularly fancy, Michael?
Well, it's still clearly very close here, and nobody wants to predict anything with any great confidence. Interestingly, the Conservatives have done an early analysis, and that seems to show that the Liberal Democrats may just have pipped Labour by 1 or 2 points, but that is really an early analysis on their part. Their own Conservative vote seems to be down from the 18% they had last time, and that obviously is going to pose serious questions to the Conservative Party, because they were second in this seat at the 2001 election, and way back in 1987 they came within 1,700 votes of winning Brent East. So Brent East is the sort of seat that the Conservatives ought to be winning in the middle of a parliament if they're the opposition party, and it looks like it's the Liberal Democrats who've made all the running here. I mean, the fascinating thing is about how few people the Conservatives seem to have had on the ground. I mean, I went round 13 polling stations this evening, and there wasn't a single Conservative teller at those stations collecting numbers, whereas both Labour and the Liberal Democrats were represented in every single one.
So no IDS effect then, but there was a Ken Livingstone effect for the Labour candidate, apparently.
Sorry, I didn't quite hear a question there.
Sorry, it must be jolly noisy there, Michael. It's very odd-looking people behind you, I must say. Ken Livingstone, what effect has he had?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, the Livingstone factor. I mean, he's very popular here because he used to be the MP, and I think, you know, he will have turned a few votes back to Labour as he's come out in the last few days very strongly in favour of the Labour candidate. I mean, it's ironic, really, that Labour's campaign has hardly mentioned Tony Blair anywhere in the literature. Tony Blair, once a huge asset to the Labour Party, now is almost a non-person in Labour terms. Absolutely remarkable. And the party's having to call on somebody that they actually expelled 4 years ago for standing for a London mayor. I mean, Ken Livingstone must be grinning all over, although of course it could rebound on him when it comes to the mayoral elections next May, because all the indications are here there has been a huge swing away from the Labour Party, and if he gets too associated with Labour, then that could affect his vote next spring.
Michael, thank you very much. We'll leave you for what's obviously going to be a very interesting evening there. Now, BBC One's political programme this week returns at 11:35, and that'll be followed on BBC One by live coverage of the Brent East by-election. A quick look at tomorrow morning's front pages. The Guardian has news that the government's ordering a big shake-up of the BBC, a wholesale inquiry into how it's funded, what it does and everything else. The Daily Telegraph, the Attorney General is telling the Americans that they've got to put terrorists on trial instead of holding them without trial. The Times, the IMF is slashing economic predictions for the Eurozone. The Financial Times has news that public spending is, if not out of control, certainly way ahead of predictions. And the Mirror and the Daily Mail both lead with news of Lord Archer's demotion. That's all from Newsnight for tonight. There is round-the-clock news coverage on BBC News 24, which you can find on cable, satellite and Freeview. Gavin will be back with more tomorrow, and Mark Lawson will be here with Newsnight Review. But until then, from all of us on the programme, night-night.
In this life, there are those who